Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren, and this is the History, Royalty and Scottish Connections virtual experience with the Palace of Holyroodhouse, brought to you by Tiqets Awakening Weeks. So for those of you who don't know, Tiqets Awakening Weeks is a 6-week celebration of the reopening of museums and attractions in 6 countries around the world. The venues participating in Awakening Weeks have worked day and night to reimagine their experiences and introduce new hygiene measures to make it safe for you to visit again. And they're also rolling out the welcome mat for those of us who aren't able to travel yet with these online experiences. So that's what you're in for today. Before I hand over to our presenters for this afternoon, there are just a few logistics issues that I want to take care of. So first of all, if you've got any questions for our presenters, you can submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen in the Zoom window. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of this experience, so please feel free to send through your questions, and we're going to try and answer as many of them as possible at the end of the session. You can also vote on your favorite questions in the Q&A sort of window by giving them a thumbs up, and then that way we can ask the best questions first. So this is a Zoom webinar. Your camera won't be on, but you can use the chat to communicate with your fellow attendees and with the speakers as well. You can also share where you're joining us from, which I can see some of you are already doing. And you can also share your reactions during the session by using the chat to message all panelists and attendees. If any of you are having any technical difficulties, use the chat again to send a message to all panelists, and we're going to try and help you out as soon as possible. If you're having trouble with audio, then it's usually you just need to leave and then rejoin, and that's usually an easy fix. Finally, we're recording this presentation, and we'll be sending the recording to all of the registrants in the coming weeks. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our hosts for this virtual experience, Deborah Clark and Sutherland Forsyth, and they're going to transport us to the world of the Palace of Holyroodhouse. So Deborah and Sutherland, please take it away.
Hello and welcome to the home of Scottish royal history, the Palace of Holyroodhouse. This is Her Majesty the Queen's official residence in Scotland, and it is a building that really has been at the centre of history for almost 900 years. First with the historic Abbey, created back in 1128, and then for the last 500 years, Edinburgh's Royal Palace, which is still a working royal residence to this day. My name is Sutherland Forsyth, and I'm the Learning Curator here at the Palace, and my team oversees the education programmes and public events and how we tell many of the stories at the Palace through the multimedia guides that people are able to use when they come as visitors. And I'm joined today by Deborah Clark, who's the Senior Curator here at the Palace. And what Deborah doesn't know about Holyrood is not worth knowing. And she's currently writing the definitive history of the palace, which is a pretty epic work. Right now, we're sitting in a historic room. We're in a building known as Abbey Strand. And the room that we're in, you can see a large stone fireplace behind us, was once lodgings for courtiers back in the reigns of Mary Queen of Scots and her son, King James VI and I. So Deborah, writing your book, it must have been quite an epic task in terms of trying to pull together this huge history.
Well, 900 years of history is a huge amount to get into one book, but it has been absolutely fascinating because there's so many interesting stories associated with this wonderful royal palace, and you'll hear, we'll just touch on some of these today, but yes, it's just full of all these different kind of royal stories. And we're now going to give you a little taster, whet your appetite, and give you a little taster of the palace and its surroundings. So Lauren's going to play us a little video.
Welcome to the Palace of Holyroodhouse, Her Majesty the Queen's official residence in Scotland. Built in the shadow of an ancient volcano, on land that was once a royal hunting ground, the palace and the now ruined abbey at its side have been a centre of royal power and ceremony for almost 900 years. Holyrood has witnessed coronations and parliaments, royal weddings and burials, and is still used by the royal family for state occasions and ceremonies today. It is one of the most significant buildings in Scotland and reflects the history of the country across the centuries.
we saw there just a taster of Holyrood, and we're going to be exploring some of the highlights, looking back through the centuries. But the image that you should be able to see on your screens now really is the image that so many people leave, having visited the palace, remembering this dramatic facade at the front of the palace. And it really is a place that every single time I arrive for work, it just sort of takes my breath away.
Well, I think one of the very special things about Holyrood is its location. It stands in the shadow of Arthur's Seat, so it's sort of surrounded by this mini mountain almost.
And Arthur's Seat was the remaining bit of a volcano, isn't it?
Yes, it's an extinct volcano, so it really looks spectacular behind the palace. But it's also at the foot of this very historic road called Royal Mile, which joins Edinburgh Castle, which is on a very high hill, again another extinct volcano, and the street follows a sort of spine right down a hill to the foot where lies the palace. Opposite we have the Scottish Parliament, and so it's in this very historic area of Edinburgh.
And the place that we're situated in right now, who we're recording and speaking to you from, sits right in between the entrance to the palace and the Parliament on the other side. So when we look out our windows, we can see the front door of the palace and the Parliament on the other side. And I think what that does is it constantly reminds us that as we see visitors streaming down, it's lovely seeing visitors coming back to the palace and being able to visit with all the different social distancing measures in place. It also reminds us when we see people coming in and enjoying it, they're often surprised that it is a working royal residence. It's not just a sort of museum.
Yes, and I think, again, that's what makes Holyrood special and rather unique. It is very much a working royal palace. Her Majesty the Queen comes here usually once a year in July, and it's an official residence. It's the official residence of the monarch in Scotland, so it's sort of equivalent to Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle in London, and it's here she carries out official engagements. And on screen you can see her examining the guard at a ceremony called the Ceremony of the Keys, when she just arrives at the palace, and here she is being presented with the keys to the city of Edinburgh by the Lord Provost. But it's also an occasion when she can entertain people, host events, carry out important ceremonies and such like. One of the key events during the week is the garden party, where she will host 8,000 people in the gardens in the palace, and it's a really, really lovely occasion.
It is, and the gardens at the palace for hundreds of years have just been a place where kings and queens, princes and princesses have always loved just the fact that you feel like you could be hundreds of miles from everywhere. They're really unique because when you stand in the gardens of the palace, you cannot see another building. So you wouldn't believe that you are in the center of a busy city. And I think that's what makes them such a unique venue when the Queen is holding a garden party, but also when people are visiting the palace, to be able to walk through. They might be staying in Edinburgh and seeing the hustle and bustle, and then they walk into the gardens and it's peace and tranquility. And there are about 10 acres of gardens or so, so they really are quite substantial.
Mm. Yes, they're really beautiful, particularly when you look out of the windows of the palace. But the palace is also used for a number of other ceremonies, in particular investitures, when the Queen will bestow honours on various citizens of Scotland. And here she is giving Sir Sean Connery.
Oh, there he is. Very good, very good.
Yes. But CBEs, OBEs and such like will all be granted here in this room in the palace, the Great Gallery.
And I think what's really nice is that it's also, whilst there are these big ceremonies, there's also the day-to-day business. You know, as head of state, Her Majesty the Queen will meet with different heads of government. For example, here we can see Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, but she'll also sometimes meet with other heads of state or other important officials. And so the day-to-day business as monarch still continues, and Holyrood becomes the centre of national life when Her Majesty the Queen is in residence. But other big occasions might take place at the palace too.
Yes, so there might be a big dinner or banquet even, and you can see here the preparations taking place for a large banquet in the Great Gallery, the largest room in the palace, where the table is beautifully laid, and the silver that's kept at the palace is actually used by the guests on the night.
But it's not just the Queen who comes and stays and uses the palace, is it?
No, other members of the royal family come as well. throughout the year. So here we have Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, again inspecting troops in the forecourt, but it's also used by Prince Charles, known as the Duke of Rothesay in Scotland, and his son, Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge, here, again surrounded by Scottish soldiers here.
And so it very much is somewhere that throughout the year, different members of the royal family might come and stay at the palace or host engagements in Edinburgh. And the sort of central point is that week in July when the Queen comes to stay, but it's a working residence throughout the year. But that still enables members of the public to actually be able to come and experience it and see inside. And I think what's so special is that it means that when you're walking through the grand staterooms, you are seeing the same spaces that are used for these sorts of official functions. But the palace's history goes back about 500 years, but the actual story of the site stretches back nearly 900 years, isn't it?
That's right, and it really starts with this building here that you see on the screen, which is the ruins of the original Abbey, Holyrood Abbey. And this is really where the actual story starts. And there's a lovely legend associated with the foundation of this abbey. And that's that King David I of Scotland, King of Scotland, was out hunting in this area. And this was a really good area for hunting, just below Arthur's Seat. And he was riding his horse and was confronted by a stag, an angry stag. And he thought, this is it. My end is coming. And then the stag calmed down. The king looked, and there was a cross had appeared between the stag's antlers. And the king thought, this is a sign. I should make a religious foundation on this site. And this is what he did. So the first building on this site was the Abbey that you see the ruins of here. And we can also see the symbol of Holyrood is a stag with a cross between its antlers, because this is how the story started. And we see this all around the palace. You can see this on the gate here. And this is how Holyrood got its name as well, because it's the Abbey of the Holy Cross, because of the cross between the antlers, but rood is the old Scots word for cross, so it's known as the Abbey of the Holyrood.
So today we would say Holyrood, sort of rhyming with Hollywood, but really it's actually come from the Holy Rood. It's an interesting one, because I think that you see the stag and the cross all over the palace. And as you say, even right on the front gates, on the badges that are the wardens at the palace wear. But actually to know that that comes from that very first legend about King David I is quite amazing. But the Abbey itself, although a ruin today, it really is a romantic space. And you get a sense, this is the wonderful front door of the Abbey, of just what a significant building this would have been. And in its heyday, this was a building which hosted parliaments and treaty signings, coronations, royal weddings, births and burials, all sorts of really significant events. And when we see it, it's just a fraction of the size that it originally would have been. It was originally twice the length of many other buildings. And I think when we see it as a ruin, it's hard to imagine that it would have been a place of real colour and life.
Well, it was an incredibly important building. It was a royal foundation. It had royal lodgings attached to it. And as you say, lots of important ceremonies took place. Yeah, but it was also a working monastery, so there were lots of extra buildings attached to it, and there were people coming and going, a lot going on. But as you say, we don't really get any sense of the colour of the building, but we sometimes do from paintings, for example.
And this is from an altarpiece, which is part of the Royal Collection, and Her Majesty the Queen has had it on loan at the Scottish National Gallery here in Edinburgh for many years, and it depicts King James III of Scots. You can see him kneeling down with a crown upon his head on the left, and his wife, Margaret of Denmark, who you can see kneeling on the right. And they got married in Holyrood Abbey. And whilst we don't know exactly where these paintings are showing them, the architecture is very reminiscent of Holyrood, and the colours really give us a sense of just how bright and sumptuous the Scottish royal court would have been in the medieval period. You can see the beautiful cloths of estate, the banners, the shields behind, the wonderful robes, the beautiful crowns. This was a glittering court, and Holyrood Abbey would have been where some of the most significant ceremonies like weddings and coronations would have taken place. And in fact, James III and Margaret of Denmark married in Holyrood Abbey. But there was another marriage which was particularly significant, which has changed the course of history, and that was a marriage involving this lady who you can see on screen here.
So this is Margaret Tudor, who is the sister of Henry VIII. Henry VIII is one of the most famous monarchs of England, and she was his sister, and she married James IV of Scotland. And so this joined the House of Stuart, the Scottish House of Stuart, and the English House of Tudor, a marriage called the Marriage of the Thistle and the Rose, and led eventually to the joining of the two dynasties and the union of the crowns, which we'll hear more about later. But it was also an important turning point for the history of Holyrood, because James IV decided he didn't want to bring his bride to just royal lodgings at the Abbey. He wanted to build a proper palace on the site, and this was the moment that the first palace was built. And so this is the earliest image we have of the first palace. And what's interesting is that if you look at the left-hand side, the tower on the left, that is the part that survives today. Here we can see it.
Yeah, you can really get that sense. And I think it's quite amazing that actually that tower has survived at all, because there are so many of these sort of historic buildings where they would have been swept away. And yet here we can see that early tower.
And this tower was where one of our most famous residents, Mary Queen of Scots, was housed. Her apartments were on the second floor of the tower.
And Mary was an incredibly significant figure. She was a woman ruling in her own right in the middle of the 16th century. She was in a tumultuous political period where you had the Protestant Reformation. Mary was a Catholic herself. She had the weight on her shoulders of having to try to get an heir, to have a successor, and a lot of pressure on her. And Holyrood was one of the residences that she spent a significant amount of time at. And so she's a really interesting figure.
She is, and she spent most of her childhood and teenage years in France. She was married to the Dauphin, who became the King of France, and then he died. And when she came back to Holyrood in 1561, aged 19, she was a widow. And it was these apartments she came back to. And I think, again, you get this real sense of history when you go in these rooms.
Yes.
This is where Mary Queen of Scots slept. This is where she moved around, where she got dressed, where she met people. And you know, this is what our visitors feel. I think these are the most, in a way, the most memorable rooms.
Totally. And I think what's so nice is that when you walk in, you almost feel like Mary could have just walked out. And when you look up at the ceiling, the beautiful painted ceiling is not a replica. That is the original ceiling that Mary would have looked up at. And there is something really special. There are an awful lot of places where you wouldn't be able to look up and see the actual ceiling that the most famous sort of queen of the 16th century, other than Elizabeth I, maybe, her great rival, she might have something to say about that. But Mary Queen of Scots, this woman who is known, Mary Queen of Scots, you're standing in the exact same place, and quite some dramatic events took place in that same room.
They certainly did. And if we look here, you'll see, so Mary was a widow, and one of the first things she had to really think about when she came back to Scotland was getting married again. And she married the gentleman in the top right, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, the man in black. But it was not a happy marriage. He was very vain and wanted a lot more power, yes, didn't he? And he was also very jealous of the gentleman below, who was Mary's private secretary, David Rizzio, who was very cultured. He spoke many languages, he played musical instruments, and Mary got on extremely well with him. Darnley was extremely jealous and wanted to get rid of him. And there was an incredibly dramatic event that took place in the palace on the night of the 9th of March, 1566. And Mary, Rizzio, and her ladies-in-waiting were dining in this tiny little room that you see on the left. It's a really small room, isn't it, Sutherland? You wonder how on earth they could have fitted it in.
It's incredibly small, and anytime you look in, you think, how did they make it?
Anyway, Darby, whose apartments were directly below Mary's, had gathered together a group of men, and they charged up a tiny staircase up to this small room, which is just off Mary's bedchamber. They knocked the tables and chairs over, they knocked the candlesticks over, they grabbed hold of Rizzio, who was terrified. He clung onto Mary's skirts. Mary herself, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, was also terrified. But they got hold of Rizzio, they dragged him through to the next room, and they stabbed him 56 times.
It's astonishing to think that this sort of thing isn't just sort of a myth or a legend, and we know it's not because Mary Queen of Scots literally wrote out an account of the incident itself. And for that to take place in her own private chambers is just sort of shocking. We can't even imagine it today, something like that happening, but to imagine Mary going through that at 8 months pregnant is just astonishing. But what always stays with so many people is that there is a reminder of that event in the next room. And it's this there.
Yes, so this, you'll see the mark, the reddish mark on the floor. And this is supposed to be where Rizzio's body was dumped when he was stabbed, and he left traces of his blood. And I think this is one of the most memorable things that people take away from Holyrood. And I think you yourself, Sullivan, will remember it from your first visit.
It's so true. I remember visiting when I must have been about 9 or 10 years old or something, and I remember my dad saying to me, "That's the blood stain. That's Rizzio's blood stain. You can see it there." And I was thinking, like, "Oh, that's it." And then when I started working here, I remember coming up and having a look in this room and seeing the blood stain, and I got the same shiver up my spine that I did back then. And I think it's the thing that so many people remember when they come and they walk through, because let's be honest, it's not the normal thing that you would see. But also, what's particularly interesting is that it is relating to this real incident, not just something that is some sort of imagined, oh, maybe there was this dreadful murder. Could it have happened here? Could it have happened somewhere? No, we know it happened here, and we know because Mary wrote it down and we have the accounts. So it's a place full of history.
It is. And then the next room that we'll see was Mary's outer chamber, where she received guests and chatted with people. But here we use it to display some of the objects that are within the royal collection that are associated with Mary, such as her pomander, which she wore around her neck and was filled with sweet-smelling herbs, such as we also have a lock of her hair. And we also have this incredibly special Renaissance jewel called the Darby Jewel. And I think Lauren is now going to play a little film which will tell you more about the Darby Jewel.
Oh, Sutherland, if you'll just stop sharing your screen, I will start sharing mine.
Yeah, I think we've just stopped.
Great.
The Darnley Jewel is full of iconography. It's either known as the Darnley Jewel, which is what we call it, or the Lennox Jewel because of Matthew Lennox. Matthew Lennox was the Earl of Lennox, and Lady Margaret Douglas became the Countess of Lennox. Their eldest surviving son was Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who was the second husband of Mary Queen of Scots. The jewel itself is heart-shaped, and the heart was the symbol of the Douglas family. One of Margaret's ancestors was deputed to carry the heart of Robert the Bruce to the Holy Land. This is where the device of the heart and the association with the Douglas family comes from. The little device in the centre, the winged heart, if you open that up, you see a skull and crossbones. So that probably indicates that the piece was like a memento mori or a commemoration of someone's death, in this case, Matthew Lennox's death. If we open it up and see what's inside, again, there are a number of different signs and symbols, and these probably represent the sort of trials and tribulations of both the Lennox and the Douglas families. We can see a salamander, which is the device of the Douglas family, a phoenix rising out of the flames, showing the trials and tribulations they went through. And there is also a pelican in her piety, and this is when a pelican pierces her breast and her young feed from the blood that drips from the breast. And this shows maternal love. we can see a rather strange figure. It's a figure of a man lying on his back, and out of his loins grows a flower. And the flower represents Darnley's son, who was James VI of Scotland and the future James I of Great Britain.
Lovely.
Deborah, the one thing I always wonder is how heavy is it? How does it feel to hold it? Because you're one of the few people to have actually held the Darby Jewel.
Well, it is heavy. You've seen, you know, it's got lots of different parts, which makes it particularly heavy, but it does fit very neatly into the palm of my hand.
Yes, you've held it, you know. Well, the Darby Jewel is in Mary Queen of Scots' outer chamber, but also hanging in that room is this portrait of Elizabeth I of England. Now, Elizabeth and Mary were simultaneously sort of cousins, friends, and rivals. And later in Mary's life, Mary was forced to abdicate the throne of Scotland. She fled to England, where she was kept under house arrest by Elizabeth I for the rest of her life, until Elizabeth eventually would sign her death warrant. But we've got a very special object, which is one of your favourites, isn't it, Deborah?
It is. This is one of my favourite objects in the Royal Collection. And one thing that makes it very special for me is that it's an embroidery that was actually done by Mary Queen of Scots herself. So you get a real sense of Mary when you look at this, when I'm lucky enough to hold it. But there's a hidden message in this embroidery, which again makes it particularly fascinating. And you'll see in the centre there's a large ginger cat, and the cat is supposed to represent Elizabeth I. And just to the side, you'll see a little grey mouse, and the mouse represents Mary Queen of Scots. And if you look even more carefully, you'll see that the cat has its paw on the mouse's tail, and therefore Elizabeth is trapping Mary and holding her captive. So it's all very clever, isn't it?
It is, and what's lovely is that when you actually look at it in the flesh, it's amazing that this sort of thing has survived, because so many of these pieces of embroidery or works on fabric or things like this from the 16th century just haven't survived, and to have it sitting there in Mary Queen of Scots' outer chamber is really quite something. But although Mary would be executed under the orders of Elizabeth I, Mary would ultimately be the victor in their rivalry, because when Elizabeth died with no heir, or rather no child of her own, her successor became her heir, and that was Mary's son, James. So James VI of Scots became King James I of England and Great Britain as a whole, and it was here at Holyrood where he found out that he had become king. So it was a remarkable change and turn of events, really, that took place. And Holyrood would continue to be a significant building. Later, in 1633, James's son, Charles I, had his Scottish coronation in Holyrood Abbey. And then his grandson, Charles II, would transform the palace. And we can see this painting. It's on display in the throne room, isn't it?
Yes, it's a magnificent painting. It's hanging in the throne room. It shows Charles II at his coronation, looking every inch a newly crowned king, I think. And it's particularly interesting because the artist is John Michael Wright, and he trained here in Edinburgh. So it's particularly appropriate that it hangs here in the Royal Palace of Edinburgh.
And this painting, like all of the other works of art and objects that we see in the Palace of Holyroodhouse, all are part of the Royal Collection. And it's this incredible range of amazing artworks and paintings, all sorts of different things. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. But we can see a plan that was made for this transformed palace.
Yes, so Charles II decided he wanted a new palace on the site to represent the monarchy in Scotland. And this is the design that the architect William Bruce came up with, and pretty much what you see today when you visit the palace. But the architect was particularly clever, because the tower on the left-hand side is the old surviving tower that we showed you earlier, and he's integrated this into a beautiful symmetrical facade and created a matching tower on the right-hand side.
And I think what's so nice about this way that it was reimagined was that you effectively have the facade of the palace looking quite different to the interior of it. But the entranceway is through that central front door, which has to be one of the most magnificent doors and entrances that I've ever seen. And it's exactly the same entrance that everybody walks through, whether it's Her Majesty the Queen, members of the royal family, or visitors to the palace today. And they all walk under this huge clock, with a big crown above it, and then this beautiful coat of arms carved in stone above the front door. And it really is a sensational thing to see as you walk underneath it. You can just see little lamps on either side, which have got crowns at the top of them and thistles in each corner. It really is a stunning entranceway. But it leads you through into this classical quadrangle.
Yes, you go right into this very calm area, and this is one of my favourite areas with the classical orders against the walls and the arcaded ground floor, which I think is reminiscent of the monastic origins of the palace. And then as you enter the palace, you'll see that the decoration is very different. There's some richly decorated Baroque interiors with particularly spectacular plasterwork ceilings. So the first entrance is up the great stair. We've seen visitors going up, and you see this amazing ceiling, all made of plasterwork, high above you. And it's you can't really see it close to, so it's lovely to look at photographs of some of the decoration there.
Yeah, and I think here it's to get a sense of the scale, the angels in each of the corners, each of them is holding part of the honours of Scotland, the historic Scottish crown jewels. Here you can see the crown in the right hand of the angel. And these are full size, they're human sized angels. And when you look up, you would think, oh, it's just a nice little carving, a nice moulding. And yet the scale of them is such that you really do feel astonished, and you feel like you're almost floating up the stairs. And I think that's what's so interesting about the architecture of the Great Stair, is that it's a square, so it's not sort of a big rectangle or a long room, and you only can really properly get a sense of how impressive it is when you actually go up it. It's always very hard to get great photographs of the Great Stair because of the angles, but when you climb up the stairs, it's as if you're being drawn up to the ceiling, past the tapestries and the frescoes on the walls.
And then it takes you into the next room, which is the throne room, and you can see the magnificent portrait of Charles II in situ. And then on into the next room, the privy chamber, again with another, the presence chamber with another elaborate ceiling. And this is where the monarch would have maybe had group audiences or audiences where people would have seen the king. And what is nice is it's used in a similar way today by the Queen, and here she is holding an audience with the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon.
And so it's nice to actually be able to walk through these rooms and to know that they're still being used. And I think that's what I really like, is when you see this photograph and you think, oh yes, I can see it's exactly the same fireplace behind them. And as you walk through this sort of floor of the palace, one of the rooms that people always particularly like is the King's bedchamber. It really is quite a sumptuous room. And the bed is impressive, but behind it you can see the tapestries. And Holyrood has one of the largest collections of tapestries anywhere in the United Kingdom. And so it's a really special place to be able to see these wonderful fine tapestries, which were traditionally used to decorate 17th century rooms. This, I should say, is one of the rooms that is no longer used as a bedchamber, but people do walk through this room when they're heading to official functions, and of course visitors can walk through it today. And this leads us through.
This leads us through to the largest room of the palace, if I glimpse of it earlier, called the Great Gallery, which is hung with around 100 portraits of the kings and one queen of Scotland, which were painted. All these were painted for Charles I and put up in the palace in the 1680s.
And in this picture, you're only seeing about half the length of the Great Gallery, but there was a particularly significant event that is believed to have taken place in this very room back in 1745, 275 years ago this year. There would have been no carpet on the floor, but there would have been a lot of dancing, because it is said that there was a ball held in this room organised for Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was famous as the man who was trying to reclaim the British throne on behalf of his father. And they were part of what was known as the Jacobite cause.
It's named after his father and grandfather, who were called James Jacobus is the Latin name for James, so that's how they got their name. And Bonnie Prince Charlie, young and handsome, came to the palace and held court here, lived in the palace as though he was royal, which he viewed himself as royal, and held a ball. He used to entertain people and carried out business meetings here as well. The little notice at the bottom of the screen is asking people to come and volunteer and come to the palace to volunteer for his cause. These are a couple of his pistols. But he also used to dine in public. And this is the room where he used to dine in. And we now have a large number of Jacobite items on display in the room, including portraits, the Bonnie Prince Charlie portrait that you see, and others of his family.
And Bonnie Prince Charlie is just such an important figure in Scottish history, somebody who people learn about in school and they discover all the stories about what he did. But there is something really special when you're actually in the very rooms that he used and seeing objects and paintings, some of which are so familiar to us. And I think what's really interesting is that at different moments in history, the palace has been a place where either nation-shaping events have taken place or events which have changed people's perceptions have happened. And one of those big occasions took place in 1822, and that was the visit of King George IV, who you can see on the left.
And here you can see him wearing his magnificent Royal Stuart tartan kilt. And there's a story behind this because he was the first reigning British monarch to visit Scotland for nearly 200 years. So it's an incredibly special and significant and symbolic occasion. And the visit was organised by the Scottish writer Sir Walter Scott, who wanted everybody to wear tartan. The whole city was turned into a tartan festival, and George IV himself ordered his outfit from an outfitter's in Princes Street, the main street in Edinburgh, and he wore this magnificent kilt when he held a reception at the palace. And it came with all the accoutrements, the sporran and the belt and the sash and the plaid and everything. And here on the right you can see the dirk, which he's wearing attached to his belt.
And you can see this painting hanging in the dining room at the palace today. This is still the same dining room that the royal family use when they're hosting dinners here at the palace. And although you can't see it in this picture, in our next slide, you can see the image that hangs opposite King George IV, and that is Queen Victoria, who was the monarch who really brought life back to Holyrood. She started using the palace from the 1850s when she and her husband, Prince Albert, started travelling up to Balmoral Castle up north in Scotland, and Holyrood was a convenient stopping off point, and they started to make it a royal home again. And Queen Victoria even painted some little watercolours from her breakfast room at the palace, and here is her watercolour of Holyrood Abbey.
So she was very interested in the palace, the history of the palace and the history of the Stuarts. So she loved looking around the palace and the Abbey when she was here. And the palace itself was decorated and done up for Queen Victoria. And we see on the next slide the dining room, but it's actually the throne room. We're looking at it from a different direction, but you've seen the throne room, and the ceiling was put in for Queen Victoria. But there were other people living in the palace at the same time. A lot of the nobility of Scotland had apartments in the palace, and so Queen Victoria couldn't use the royal dining room. She had to use the throne room as her dining room as well.
And the throne room was remodeled and changed not a lot of time later, when King George V and Queen Mary, who are the grandparents of our present Queen, they made Holyrood their official residence in Scotland, and they really transformed the palace and modernised it. And we still have on display their throne chairs sitting in the throne room at the palace, and you can see them here on the screen. But the royal family have continued to use Holyrood. You can see in the next picture King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, and also you can see our present Queen and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. This was just when they were engaged.
About a week after their engagement was announced, their first visit together was to the Palace of Holyroodhouse in Edinburgh, which is very nice. But the Queen became Queen in 1952. She's continued to use the palace, to visit the palace and entertain and meet with people on a very regular basis. So here's the garden party again here, and you can see Arthur's seat in the background.
And I think it's nice to be able to see the palace as a working residence with lots of different events taking place and the Queen carrying out her official duties as monarch. In fact, in the next slide, I think you can actually see when Pope Benedict XVI came on a visit to Britain, here he is at the front door of the palace with Her Majesty the Queen. And what's really nice is that the palace hasn't stood still. We're still seeing new things being added to it. And just over a year ago, a new painting was hung at the palace, and it is of Her Majesty the Queen.
So this was a painting commissioned by the Royal Collection specifically for Holyrood, to be hung at Holyrood. And it's a painting of the Queen wearing her thistle robes. The Order of the Thistle is the highest order of chivalry in Scotland, and the Queen is the sovereign of the order. And the artist is Nikki Phillips, and we're now going to hear a little bit about how she found it painting the Queen.
Yes, normally when our visitors come to the palace, they use our multimedia guides where they have little exclusive videos to be able to see. And so we're going to let you see one of those little exclusive videos now, which is the artist Nikki Phillips painting this royal portrait.
Let's hear from Nikki Phillips, the artist who created this painting of Her Majesty the Queen.
It's such a wonderful privilege to be able to have a sitting with the monarch, but it is quite daunting. Her Majesty is standing in front of Arthur's seat with Salisbury Crags just behind her, and I've deliberately left it fairly loose because I don't want that to impede on this portrait, which is really about the Queen. But at the same time, it's a nice reference to Scotland, and because this is for Holyrood Palace, the Queen is wearing the robes of the Order of the Thistle, which is the highest order of chivalry in Scotland. Velvet is extraordinary because it is the single thing that people pick up on, and you know, I've had in the past, that is extraordinary, it looks exactly like velvet. And they think that you've done something completely brilliant, but in fact velvet is incredibly easy to paint because it's effectively just one solid colour with a little bit of light just on the edge, which you'll be able to see on the folds. The worst bit of painting it actually was the rope with the tassels. That rope was very fiddly, and I've tried not to do it in over much detail, just to give a view of it, but it's very intricate, all this.
And what's so nice is that when people go around the palace, they can see this painting hanging there in the royal dining room. And as we were saying earlier, all the different items that people see in the palace are part of the royal collection. And we have a new gallery. Well, I say a new, it was created during Her Majesty the Queen's reign, and it was created in 2002. And that is the Queen's Gallery. And it shows changing exhibitions of items from the royal collection. The Royal Collection is a charitable trust, so it doesn't receive any sort of public funding. Instead, all the money that comes from people buying tickets for an exhibition or to visit the different royal residences goes towards the conservation of all the objects in the collection and help us to enable more and more people to see them. And so last year, I think it was, the 1,000,000th visitor came to visit the Queen's Gallery in Edinburgh, and we've had some spectacular exhibitions there, haven't we?
All kinds of exhibitions. No, we only show works of art from the Royal Collection, these drawings by Leonardo da Vinci, which is the exhibition you see on the screen, to Italian paintings, to historic photographs, to Russian works of art. And at the moment, we've got a spectacular exhibition of Indian art called Eastern Encounters, 400 years of Indian paintings that have been collected by or given to various monarchs over the centuries.
And I have to say, I think this photograph just does not do these works of art justice. What's so special about them is that we're so used to seeing wonderful old master paintings in sort of European art from the 17th century, for example. But the manuscripts and paintings that we see in this exhibition are the equivalents from the Indian subcontinent. And it's this sort of exhibition which really gives us a sense of the breadth and diversity of the Royal Collection, that you can have wonderful works of Russian art, beautiful 16th century and 15th century drawings, and then wonderful manuscripts from India. It really is a spectacular collection, and lovely to have these changing exhibitions like Eastern Encounters, which is on at the moment. But for people who aren't maybe able to come so easily, or people who want to find out a bit more, the Royal Collection Trust website, which is rct.uk, has information about all the different royal residences, as well as a place where you can search the Royal Collection and you can find different images, all different objects. You can get high definition images of different items in the Royal Collection and really dig deeper and find out more. So it really is a great resource for people to be able to explore and see different bits of information about what is possible. But things keep changing, and that's one of the things that's great, because the Royal Collection is always looking to see how can we improve the visitor experience for people when they're coming to one of the palaces. So it's about trying to find new special opportunities for people to explore. So just a few weeks ago, for the first time ever, the Royal Kitchens here at Holyrood have opened to the public, and they're only able to be open for a limited time, and they're not really what people imagine of a Royal Kitchen, are they?
No, so what you see on the screen, these are the kitchens. They've been in this place for about 100 years, and they're very functional kitchens, because these are the kitchens that are still in use today. This is where the meals, when Her Majesty the Queen is in residence, where if any dinners or banquets are held, this is where the catering is done. So that makes them pretty special, but they're not ancient kitchens with big spits and huge chunks of meat roasting over a fire. That's not what you will see. But you can see in the image that all the copper saucepans, these have been long associated with the kitchens at Holyrood, and they're still used today.
I wouldn't fancy polishing those copper pans. That's one thing that I really wouldn't fancy having the responsibility of doing that. But I think that's the nice thing, is really only seeing a small section of the kitchens here, but this is the working royal residence. Things keep changing. We have, for example, in 3 weeks' time, we have a new garden opening at the palace, taking inspiration from historic gardens at the palace. It's a physic garden where we have it full of different medicinal plants, winding walkways, order beds, and it's a wonderful new area and a beautiful addition to the wider palace experience, and an opportunity for people to really enjoy the outdoors as well as the indoors. And inside the palace, over the last couple of years, there's been a huge project to represent how we show the paintings and the works of art, and just about every painting on the public roof, I think, has been rehung. I think, Deborah, you were responsible with making sure which pot goes where and checking they're all in the right place. But it's just lovely now to have the doors of the palace back open for people to be able to come and see. And we've only been able to scratch the surface this afternoon. We could probably talk and talk and talk, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some questions. But if you've never been to the palace, hopefully you'll be able to walk through the doors, that you can see one of our colleagues here, Megan, standing at the doors, and be able to experience the home of Scottish royal history yourselves. So I think, Lauren, if you're ready, we can take a few questions if you fancy.
That was really, really lovely, and it just makes me want to come over right now and experience the Palace of Holyroodhouse for myself. It was really a treat. So we've only got a couple of minutes left, about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and ask you as many questions as I can. We've got quite a lot. So up at the top of our list of questions is, what royal births and weddings have taken place at the Palace of Holyroodhouse?
Oh, well, there have been quite a few.
Yes. So most of the royal weddings are quite historical, that took place in the Abbey that Sutherland mentioned. But there was a wedding that took place, or reception that took place relatively recently. I think it's 2011, when the Queen's granddaughter, Zara Phillips, got married to Mike Tyndall. And they got married in a church just up the road from the palace, called Canongate Kirk, and they held their reception at the palace. So that was a very special occasion. Almost every member of the royal family you can think of were here. They stayed in the palace, and they left the palace to go up to the Canongate Kirk and came back and and attended the reception, and the photographs were all taken here.
Yes, so you can see the wedding photographs taken in Holyrood Abbey, which is the site of many different important occasions. So historic kings such as James II of Scots was born in Holyrood Abbey, and weddings including Margaret Tudor, James III and his wife, but also other important occasions took place in the wider palace. Mary Queen of Scots got married to her third husband at Holyrood, and so there are various different important historic occasions that have taken place here.
Amazing. One of the other questions we've got is how big is Holyrood House? How does it compare in size to Windsor, for example?
Well, Windsor is enormous, so Holyrood is quite modest in scale compared to Windsor. I think there's about 80 bedrooms. Is that about right? I think.
Oh, well, Deborah, we'll trust you. We'll trust you on this.
But it's, you know, we've taken you through some of the highlights, but it's arranged sort of in a square shape, and so it's quite compact for a palace.
So there are 4 floors in the palace, and on the ground floor you've got sort of things like the royal kitchens. On the first floor you have the state apartments, and then there are another 2 floors as well. And so what's really nice is that each different part is quite different, and I think it's a building that one of the things that members of the royal family have commented on is that there is an intimacy to the palace, which is, it's a very different scale to somewhere like Buckingham Palace, and there's quite a homely feel actually about it. You can walk from one room to the other without sort of feeling exhausted. So it's really a really special place.
What a treat to be able to walk to the next room without feeling exhausted. Deborah, I seem to recall that you're writing a book. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so I've been working on it for a number of years. As you can see, there's a lot of history to get through, but covering the history really from the foundation of the Abbey right up to the present day. So covering all these themes that we discussed today, but trying to unearth more stories, the stories of the craftsmen who worked at the palace, as well as the visitors, all the extra people who lived here, some of the Scottish nobility, and all the royal events that took place here, as well as some of the treasures within the palace. It's set, Sutherland said, in beautiful grounds, so there's going to be a chapter on the gardens and also a chapter on this building that we're sitting in now, because this is what was used for courtiers and actually has a very rich history as well. So we're just pulling together all the images, the illustrations and maps and everything that might go with this incredibly complicated history.
It does sound like quite the project. Another question that we've got from our audience is, does the palace have a cemetery for pets or for people, or for people?
Well, in Holyrood Abbey, there are actually some kings and queens buried in a royal tomb. So the Abbey is a really fascinating place because there are a number of people buried there, but also there are memorials to other people. So when you walk into what survives the Abbey, you are surrounded by these different stories, and some of the people are very well known and others are people who one might never have heard of, and yet when you start digging into their stories, it's fascinating. So when you stand in the ruins of Holyrood Abbey, you are literally surrounded by these different figures from history. But interestingly, the plainest and simplest tomb of all is the royal tomb. That's where King James V, Mary Queen of Scots' father, is buried today.
Oh, that's interesting. I suppose sort of sticking with the Abbey theme, someone's asked, when did the Abbey become derelict?
Well, it went through several phases, but the Reformation took place in Scotland in 1560, and just before that there'd been a battle with the English, and some of the Abbey got damaged. And then at the time of the Reformation, the monastery sort of closed down. It was no longer a functioning monastery, and so a lot of the buildings were disused. And parts of the Abbey were knocked down. And then in the 17th century, near the end of the 17th century, again, there was a riotous mob in Edinburgh that destroyed a lot of the Abbey as well. And in the 18th century, the roof fell in. So it's had quite a dramatic story. Having been this most wonderful Scottish Abbey, really important Abbey, it then went through a series of times when parts of it were destroyed, and the roof falling in seems to be the absolute final straw.
In terms of sort of significance and scale, if you imagine somewhere like Westminster Abbey, which of course we see from these big royal occasions, that is the sort of scale that we would have been looking at for Holyrood Abbey. It was really significant, and today you are seeing just a tiny fraction of what was once there, but it was hugely, hugely important.
Oh, wow. I suppose, could you tell us a little bit more about the architecture and maybe the different stages of building the palace?
So the oldest tower that we saw near the beginning of the presentation was built in the 1530s in what it was really quite a defensive style. It was a, you know, it was a solid castle that the king would live in and know that he was safe. And then when it was rebuilt for Charles II, and I showed you that the right-hand tower was the sort of mirror image of the older tower, there was no longer a need for the palace to be defensive. It was just looking good, but looking impressive. So it represented the monarchy. Now, Charles II never actually visited the palace, sadly, but it very much represented him. And so it was built in this very solid style in the late 17th century with a lot of classical notes to it, columns and pilasters using different classical orders. And so outside the palace, it's quite sort of, not simple, but very sort of classical looking. And it's inside, you get the more Baroque feeling with these wonderful decorative ceilings, and the rooms that we've taken you through. One of the characteristics of a Baroque palace is that you would progress through these rooms, and they became grander and grander until, if you were really important, you had your audience with the king in his bedchamber. And that was really the most important room in the palace.
And it's got a painted ceiling as well.
Yeah.
Ceiling in the centre of it. And the interiors at Holyrood are regarded as some of the finest 17th century interiors anywhere in Britain. So it's really nice to be able to walk through these rooms that are of the highest quality from that time, and that they're still in use today. And
as well as the plasterwork ceilings, you've got panelled walls, oak panelled walls, very characteristic of 17th century architecture, and as they would have been at the time, hung with tapestries. This is very typical of 17th century interiors.
Okay. We still have so many questions left, but I think that's pretty much all we've got time for. So I think we're all going to have to go to the Palace of Holyroodhouse for ourselves so that we can see more of this beautiful building and hear more about it. So I think that's pretty much all from us. Thank you to Deborah and Sutherland especially for joining us and for sharing all of this amazing information with us. To everyone who joined us for the session today, thank you very much to you as well. If you're in the UK, you can experience UK Awakens Week in person. You can find out more about it at tiqets.com/blog/awakening weeks. And you can also visit the Palace of Holyrood House as well, of course, as part of Awakening Weeks. Yeah, thanks again to everyone, and we look forward to finding more ways to culture with all of you again very soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.